I hand the microphone over to you. I arrived here this afternoon with a sense of some excitement that I was going to go on as Roy Hudd's support. I was quite careful not to have any jokes in case I preempted him. It's now turned out the other way, that Roy's had to go and I'm following him, and so that's even more embarrassing. I'm going to sit down, not for any weariness reason, but because it makes it easier to see my notes. And what I'm going to do is to talk a little more personally, perhaps, than other people have done, because I think my regard for Al-Boli is as high as anybody else's, but I don't know how much more original I have to say about him at this point. I don't speak because I applaud Ray's book. I think it's a fantastic book.
Yes, Ray's still for 2
Are we on? Yeah.
Also, do yourself a favour and go like that.
Pardon?
Go with the microphone like this.
I'm always just Mike Dutton, who knows more about microphone technique than anybody else. Thanks, thank you. And I know the least, which is shameful. So I really applaud Ray's book. I think it's the only book on Al-Boli that is worth bothering about in this day and age, because it contains everything, and it's wonderful. I nevertheless feel that there are more books about Al-Boli to be written, not on the factual research historical level, but in terms of interpretation and delving into what really was the significance of this man. Because for me, it's like I'm not really going to talk in this way about Boli for very long, but I'll just tell you this, that what amazes me is the paradox of the career, that he is never, in those 10 London years, and it's not much more than 10, he is never constantly a star, he is never constantly a non-entity, he is always in and out. He substituted for practically every other dance band vocalist there was, but even up to the end, and he was working, he stopped recording with Lou Stone in 1938, I think for sort of contractual reasons, which no one has quite perhaps archived that, but they continued to work on the stage and on the radio, and there are quite a lot of documentation about the the salaries that people got. And the only concession that Al got when he worked for Lou is that he might go away with £4 where the others got 3. I mean, there was very little discrimination in terms of him as being a person of the kind of stature we now assume he is. And there's a kind of mystery here, and there's a mystery to do with the personality, also a mystery to do with the odd nature of the business at that time, but it's one of the things that continues to fascinate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I first got into Al-Boli, and I would start by saying that Al and I have been together a long time, and that when we first started I was probably a bit underage, because I think the first Boli record I heard, I was probably not much more than 6, and 78 was already aging, and I can even remember what it was, and it was still one of the more obscure of the things to do with Lou Stone, the Red Maple Leaves, but it somehow hooked me, and whatever I then did in life from then on, Al and that voice tended to be part of the emotional and hobby background, put it that way. But there were 3 people in this relationship, and Lou Stone was the other one. And Lou was, of course, still around, and in due course, but I left it rather too late in his life, I made contact with Lou. But before that, I'd met somebody else, and that was a man called Dennis Potter. And one of Dennis Potter's first interventions in that area of my interest was to proclaim to a university newspaper that it was a well-known fact that I had a much higher regard for Lou Stone than the Prime Minister, or probably Shakespeare. Now I suppose the jury is still out on Shakespeare, but it was one of Dennis's exaggerations. He wasn't that far wrong. Well, in due course, I reached the dizzy heights of being a junior script editor in BBC Drama, and I think that gave me, it's really kind of trivial, but it was a trigger, that gave me somehow the feeling that I could approach a great man like Lou Stone, partly because I had the notepaper. I could actually write to him on BBC notepaper and be taken seriously. And I did so, and in due course a meeting was fixed up with Lou, and I went round to the house, and he came to the door with my letter in his hand. And he said, "You've taken a long time." I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Stone, I didn't know I was late." He then handed me the letter, and it said, 24th of January, 1067. So that was a beginning with Lou, and I spent a lot of time with Lou, and I gave Lou a lot of attention, which I think was much appreciated until he died. And of course what then died was the project we had to, as it were, write a book together. Lou had done a lot of recording about his early career, but it stopped when Lou died, and all I did was to bring out a book that people do know, a book in 1971, which is more of a sort of compendium than anything else, but it's got a lot of material in there. And I don't, incidentally, and I have to restrain myself by talking too much about this, I don't regard the present book, which has appeared about Lou Stone, as being an adequate or justifiable entity. There are real background problems with that, which shouldn't have taken place, but there it is, it's out there, and if people want to buy it, they can. So there was this rather eerie timing between Lou's death and my professional activity, because I was already, Lou died in February, and I was already, by this time at London Weekend, in pre-production with a notorious piece of work, which Ray's already referred to, Moonlight on the Highway. And I think we made that in April of that same year, and Joyce Stone came to the studio, and I still, in a way, blush of my insensitivity at just bringing her along to that event, which was so diffused with content of her husband, and there she was sitting, watching the thing being put together in the very piecemeal and ramshackle way that you did with television studio material at that time, and there was almost nobody for her to kind of talk to, because I was too busy doing the job. But from then on, Joyce became an extremely close friend, and it never occurred to me to do anything else but stay there. But poignantly, Joyce said to me, quite late last year, in the course of not very much, she said, "Do you know, you came to the funeral, and I thought that was the last I'd see of you." And all I can say is that it never crossed my mind not to remain attached, both because of personal interest and because my affection and, as it were, professional commitment for that music, along with quite different things I was also doing, remained very strong. And Moonlight on the Highway, which I will talk about a bit, I mean, I don't know whether Ray was being generous when he talked about it earlier this afternoon, or whether his memory had slipped a bit, but at the time it was received with total hatred and derision by everybody, you know, your equivalents, our equivalents of those years. And the final scene of Moonlight on the Highway has quite a mischievous connection with what we are doing here, because it's the same thing. It's a scene in which there is a meeting of the, I don't know what it's called, the Golden Age Society or something like that, but exactly, they're doing what we're doing. They're there to celebrate Al, and because Lou will also doubtlely slipped in a reference to Lou, and in the celebrations for the evening they play, we included, I think, an edited version of My Melancholy Baby, which you just saw, and it is in that respect a celebration. But Dennis Potter never did anything completely straight, and that was partly his strength, and I think the production mischievously sort of exaggerated that unstraightness in some superficial ways. For example, and I'm not flattering you when I say this, the extras that we had, the actors representing